At 99 years old, Mel Brooks no longer speaks with the restraint of a man protecting a legacy. He speaks like someone who has carried nearly a century of memories, disappointments, and quiet resentments. For the first time, he has begun to talk openly about the actors who wounded his trust, disrupted his rhythm, or threatened the fragile balance that held his chaotic worlds together. Mel Brooks built his universe on timing, loyalty, and a sacred respect for ensemble comedy, and when someone fractured that rhythm, the damage lingered longer than any joke ever could. Now, looking back across the decades, he finally names the 5 actors whose presence left scars he never fully forgot. 5 collaborations that reminded him that even in comedy, heartbreak has a long memory. Jerry Lewis, the genius Mel couldn't work with. For Mel Brooks, Jerry Lewis was the kind of genius you admire from afar, because up close the brilliance burned too hot, too wild, and too consuming for anyone else to breathe. In private, Brooks would describe Lewis with a conflicted tone, a mixture of awe for his craftsmanship and exhaustion at the thought of sharing a set with him. By the mid-1980s, when Brooks was developing Liffinks, a satire about a billionaire thrust into homelessness, studio executives suggested Lewis for a major supporting role. They believed his prestige and reputation would elevate the project. Brooks rejected the idea immediately. He knew exactly what Lewis brought with him: rewrites in the middle of a take, challenges over every syllable in the script, and a force of personality so overwhelming it could suffocate the chemistry of an entire ensemble. "I don't need someone who thinks he's funnier than the film," Brooks reportedly told his producer. It wasn't just ego, it was incompatibility on a structural level. Brooks built comedy like architecture: timing, balance, interlocking performances. Lewis built comedy like a storm, unpredictable and centered around himself. The two philosophies could coexist in Hollywood, but never in the same room. A mutual acquaintance arranged a dinner to test the waters, a neutral opportunity for the two legends to feel each other out. Brooks arrived curious. Lewis arrived late, launched into an uninterrupted monologue about the future of American comedy, and barely acknowledged Mel at all. Brooks listened, choosing his replies carefully, and eventually slipped out early. No shouting, no confrontation. Just a quiet, permanent conclusion. They could never work together. Later, Brooks summarized the experience with devastating simplicity. He wanted applause. And for a man who demanded ensemble harmony above individual ego, that was the end. They remained civil in public, but everyone in Hollywood understood. There was no affection, no lost opportunity, only a recognition that Lewis's brilliance came with a cost Mel Brooks was never willing to pay. In Brooks's world, talent wasn't the currency, trust was, and Jerry Lewis, for all his genius, could never surrender to the rhythm of someone else's universe. Gene Wilder, the betrayal that never healed. Among all the actors Mel Brooks worked with, none occupied a deeper, more intimate space in his creative soul than Gene Wilder. Their bond was not simply professional, it was alchemical. Together, they exploded the boundaries of comedy with Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, weaving chaos and tenderness into something no one had seen before. Wilder was the only actor Brooks trusted enough to share unfinished thoughts, half-formed scenes, or jokes without punchlines. Gene had the uncanny ability to complete Mel's sentences before they were spoken, to shape a moment instinctively, to turn raw ideas into gold. Which is why what happened next left such a lasting wound. After Young Frankenstein in 1974, Wilder poured his entire heart into a script he believed represented the next step of his artistic evolution: The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes's Smarter Brother. He wrote it. He wanted to direct it. And he wanted Mel Brooks to stand beside him as producer, but Brooks said no. Not because the script lacked promise, not because he doubted Wilder's mind, but because he genuinely believed Gene wasn't ready to direct. He feared Wilder would be stepping into a role that could harm him more than help. But Wilder didn't hear protection. He heard rejection. The fragile trust between them cracked. Wilder moved forward without him, pulling in familiar faces like Marty Feldman and Madeline Kahn, trying to recreate the old comfort without the old partner. But the magic wasn't there. Brooks watched from a distance, silently grieving as their effortless rhythm evaporated. For years, the two men drifted apart, not through anger or public accusations, but through a quiet, suffocating silence. Mel later confided to a friend, "It was like watching your brother pack his bags and leave home, except he left carrying your best punchline." They eventually crossed paths again, unexpectedly. A brief handshake, a few gentle jokes, a fragile thaw of something that had once been unbreakable. But the full trust, the unspoken creative bond that fueled their masterpieces, never returned. Wilder had stepped out of the sacred circle, and Brooks, fiercely protective of loyalty, never reopened that door. In the end, the tragedy wasn't the separation. It was the knowledge that two souls who once completed each other's sentences would never again create side by side. Chevy Chase, the ego that never fit Mel's universe. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Chevy Chase's name hovered around Mel Brooks's projects like an unavoidable suggestion that never quite landed. Studio executives pushed relentlessly, convinced that Chase's star power, fresh off Saturday Night Live, Fletch, and a string of successful comedies, would give Brooks's films another layer of commercial appeal. On paper, Chevy seemed perfect. Sharp timing, deadpan delivery, a face instantly recognizable to audiences. But Mel Brooks shut down the idea every single time, not cautiously, not reluctantly, instantly, because Brooks had already identified the one flaw he could never work around. Chevy Chase was not a team player. Brooks had long observed Chase from a distance. The biting remarks, the icy pauses that chilled a room, the quick wit that could amuse and alienate in the same breath. In private conversations, Mel described him as a performer who wasn't listening to the scene. He was waiting for the room to stop talking so he could prove he was the smartest one in it. For Brooks, that attitude was poison. His films thrived on ensemble rhythm, on actors who built moments together, passing energy back and forth like oxygen. Chase didn't pass energy. He absorbed it. The closest Chevy ever came to entering Mel's cinematic orbit was during the casting discussions for Spaceballs in 1986. Studio executives aggressively pushed him for the role of Dark Helmet. He had the voice, the dryness, even the cultural weight to carry the parody. Brooks barely considered it. His mind was already set on Rick Moranis, an actor who could commit fully to a joke and still step back when the rhythm demanded it. "Rick knows when to move forward," Brooks later explained. "More importantly, he knows when to step back. Chevy only knows how to interrupt." Even their one and only meeting, a short, awkward encounter, told Brooks everything he needed to know. Chase arrived with a swagger that filled the room. Brooks arrived searching for connection, timing, music in the conversation. He found none of it. They parted politely. Brooks delivered a diplomatic smile and murmured, "Maybe in another universe." Everyone knew he didn't mean this one. Brooks would later speak cautiously about actors who were too self-aware to be truly present in a scene. Interviewers sometimes pushed him, asking bluntly whether he meant Chevy Chase. Brooks always dodged the question with a knowing smile. The truth was simple. Chase wasn't hated for his talent. He was rejected for his refusal to surrender ego to ensemble. And in Mel Brooks's world, comedy without humility was comedy that broke the entire machine. Harvey Korman, the brilliant storm, Mel could no longer contain. Harvey Korman arrived in Mel Brooks's world with the thunder of a proven legend. Fresh from the Carol Burnett show, he carried a reputation for reinvention, improvisation, and a kind of elastic comedic intelligence that could stretch a script into something unexpected and unforgettable. Brooks trusted him early on and cast him in some of his most iconic films. Blazing Saddles, High Anxiety, History of the World, Part 1. On screen, Corman was electric, precisely the kind of performer who could elevate a scene with a single raised eyebrow. But behind that brilliance was a tension Brooks rarely spoke about publicly, a friction that grew more intense with each project. The breaking point emerged during the production of High Anxiety in 1977. Corman had been cast as Dr. Charles Montague, the rigid, sinister head of the Psychoneurotic Institute for the Very, Very Nervous, a role that required sharp timing and tight control. But Corman came into the role determined to rebuild it from scratch. He proposed new quirks, new mannerisms, whole rewritten sequences based on his instincts rather than the script. Brooks understood how dangerous that impulse was. His films were carefully orchestrated symphonies. Improvisation wasn't prohibited, but it had to serve the rhythm, not overpower it. "We already wrote the funny part," Brooks reminded him. "We just need you to do it." Corman bristled, and from that moment forward, the set became a silent battleground. He began questioning blocking, adjusting pauses, reinterpreting punchlines as though reshaping the film itself. Brooks, usually playful and open to chaos, started guarding the production with uncharacteristic severity. Conversations grew shorter. Notes were delivered through assistants. What should have been a joyful collaboration slowly transformed into what crew members later described as quiet warfare, a daily, unspoken contest of wills. Yet none of this appeared on screen. Corman was too skilled, too professional, too innately gifted to let backstage tension leak into his performance. His portrayal of Dr. Montague remains one of the most memorable in the film. But the cost was high. After High Anxiety, Mel Brooks never cast him again, not out of resentment, but because the process had drained something essential from both men. Comedy had turned into negotiation, and negotiation into fatigue. Brooks later said, "Some actors bring joy to a set. Harvey brought brilliance, but the brilliance came with resistance. They respected each other until the end, praised each other in interviews, but never worked together again. The rhythm, the sacred rhythm, had been broken, and for Mel Brooks, nothing was more fatal than that." Frank Langella, the actor. Too serious for Mel's chaos. Frank Langella entered Mel Brooks's orbit at a moment when Brooks was crafting one of his most ambitious comedic worlds. Dracula, dead and loving it in the early 1990s. The film demanded velocity, jokes layered on absurdity, physical comedy crashing into deadpan seriousness, a tightrope walk between parody and precision. Langella, fresh off a celebrated Broadway run as Dracula himself, seemed on paper like the perfect embodiment of the role. He was tall, commanding, elegant, and possessed the kind of brooding charisma that made audiences believe in ancient sorrow and seduction. But what made him extraordinary in drama made him incompatible with Mel Brooks's brand of controlled chaos. From the first rehearsals, the mismatch was undeniable. Langella approached Dracula as a tragic, gothic figure, a creature shaped by centuries of pain and isolation. Brooks wanted a different creature entirely. A vampire who could slip on a rug, misjudge a doorway, tumble into slapstick disaster while still speaking with aristocratic dignity. But Langella stayed rooted in solemnity. Every line he delivered felt carved in stone, every gesture weighed down by theatrical gravitas. Crew members whispered, half-jokingly, "Are we making a comedy or an opera?" The energy that Brooks depended on, a loose, reactive rhythm, collapsed under the heaviness of Langella's seriousness. Brooks tried to steer the ship gently. He offered notes, encouragements, small nudges toward looseness. Langella nodded politely, listened respectfully, and then returned moments later to the same marble-still performance. The cast hesitated. Rehearsals dragged. The production's comedic pulse began to falter. And then came the moment that sealed Langella's fate. During a test read, Brooks handed him a line designed as a classic Brooks twist, melodrama that would crash unexpectedly into slapstick. Langella paused and asked earnestly, "Do you want me to mock the text?" Brooks stared at him before replying quietly, "No, I want you to survive it." Within a week, the decision was final. There was no argument, no public statement, no bitterness, just a quiet parting. And in Langella's place came Leslie Nielsen, a master of straight-faced absurdity, an actor who could hold complete seriousness even as everything around him unraveled into lunacy. Nielsen wasn't the elegant Dracula of Broadway. He was the Dracula Mel Brooks needed. Official explanations cited creative differences, but everyone close to the film understood the truth. Frank Langella wasn't wrong for the role. He was simply wrong for Brooks's universe. In Mel's world, comedy demanded surrender, and Langella never let go. In the end, Mel Brooks's long life in comedy has taught him that talent alone never guarantees harmony. The 5 actors he named were brilliant in their own ways, but they collided with the rhythm, trust, and humility he needed to build his worlds. At 99, he finally speaks without fear, not out of bitterness, but out of honesty, a reflection of the costs behind the laughter. Which of these names surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that reveal the real Hollywood behind the scenes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.